Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Stories That Shape Us podcast. My name is Joanna Daniel. In this week's Stories That Shape Us, as I shared yesterday, we're talking about sexual trauma and some of the ways that it impacts our lives. So, for today's episode, I have a special guest, and she's a couples therapist. We're talking about how sexual trauma affects intimacy and connection in marriages. So, she's an author, a speaker, and a psychotherapist that works with couples and individuals. And so, help me welcome Alison. Thank you for joining us, Alison. Is there anything you'd like to share about yourself before we get into the conversation?
Well, thank you for having me, Joanna. I think you've done a good job. I think what you've shared about me is appropriate. So let's just get stuck in.
Awesome. So we had this pre-conversation talking about sexual trauma and how it impacts um, intimacy and connection in relationships. I wanted to do this as it's Sexual Abuse Awareness Month because I do it myself sometimes, but I wanted the perspective of somebody who worked with couples to see how, just talk about how this plays out and some of the things that couples can do to help when this is a feature in the marriage. Now, I'm talking about a marriage, and I know you work with safe marriages, marriages that are safe, there's no abuse. How can somebody tell their partner, and how can the couple now work with this change that has come in? And I say change because sometimes it changes dynamic after the conversation has happened.
Mhm.
Of course, the person who experienced the trauma knows that it's happening the whole time, but now when they've built the courage up, if it hasn't been done before. But let me say this first. Do you advise people tell before or after marriage that, I've experienced sexual trauma?
Obviously, if you can communicate that before marriage, you know, it, that's that would be really good because then you give each other the opportunity to really process what that might mean for you as an individual and in the context within the context of your marriage. That sexual trauma is a very sensitive thing, and for some people it might be very tricky to disclose that before marriage. So it's very difficult to say if there's a right or wrong. I think it depends on the individual. It depends on what they feel comfortable talking about and when they feel comfortable talking about. But at some point, I'm hoping that this is a discussion that happens
Mm,
between the couple. And I don't think that anyone should be blamed for not
mm,
talking about it before
of
marriage
course.
or for choosing to talk about it after marriage. When we talk about trauma, we're talking about something that's happened that affects the way we think or we respond. Sometimes people don't always remember all of what happened
Mm,
in that
mm,
traumatic situation.
mhm,
One way of coping with trauma is just burying that event and not really remembering it clearly or only remembering fragments of what happened. And so it might not always be possible to talk about it before people get married because sometimes they might not be triggered enough to actually recollect all of the
yeah.
trauma or actually in fact that they had this trauma. So it depends on the individual. It depends on what's going on for them at the time, if they can disclose it, if they can talk about it before marriage. Some people do, but
Mm.
I don't think a lot of people talk about it before they get married. I think a lot of people talk about it probably possibly after marriage.
And I suppose some people don't know how it's going to impact
Yeah,
before, even if that is if you have access to the information. I didn't have access to that information before
yeah,
um, marriage, was re-traumatized giving birth, and then was dealing
yeah,
with it like about 4 years
yeah,
into the marriage. So that I didn't have access to the information. So when I asked, I was thinking, if you have access to the information, if you're doing your healing, if you have some understanding of how it's affected you, is it well, if it's safe, then if you have access to the information, is it advisable to talk about it before, if the person know and have access to the information and some of the ways that it's impacted?
I mean, if you know on some of the ways that it's impacted, then you know, I think it's best to talk about it um, before you get married. I think that's something that trauma is something that affects people on an ongoing basis, and if you
Yeah,
can both be open and transparent about what's happened, how it's happened, it might effective communication is really key in all
mm,
relationships and in marriages. And if you're with somebody who is understanding, who is caring, who is empathic, who is compassionate, you can have that discussion and still go on to have a very healthy and fulfilling marriage. It just means that you've got somebody alongside you to kind of walk that journey of healing with, and to support you on that journey.
yeah,
Having said that, um,
mm,
it also depends on the person you're with, and how you gauge their response might be, or whether they're ready, or whether they might need some sort of professional input as well, as
mm,
part of that
mm,
that process, that journey. So I
mm,
think there are a number of factors to think about, but if you're aware of it, if you're going through your healing, if the person that you're with is supportive, open-minded and understanding, and can be compassionate and empathic, then it's a good thing to effectively communicate that information.
And you mentioned all the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation, because you said if your partner is supportive, understanding, empathetic, and compassionate, and that's what somebody who is healing from sexual trauma, which at whichever place the conversation happens in the relationship, that's what somebody who's healing really needs: empathy, compassion, understanding, and support and care. And that's why I wanted to talk about it, because I know there's sometimes it's the opposite. It doesn't happen, and that's why sometimes there's a fear. It's a taboo subject anyway, and it's a fear of talking about it generally. So when we're going to talk about it in our marriage, then there's that fear: am I going to be supported? Am I going to be understood? Will I have compassion? Will they be empathetic? Will any of these things happen? So how does that impact connection, Alison, if this thing is has happened to me,
Hmm.
but I can't talk about it, but it's I am carrying all the impact on my own, and I cannot bring it into the space. How would that impact connection?
It gets very difficult to connect, because there's so many things that will trigger a memory. There's so many. It could be a sound. It could even be silence that could
Mm,
trigger a memory. And when that memory is triggered, for a lot of people, they kind of are in a place where they're almost re-experiencing that
mhm.
abuse all over again. Some people will freeze. Some people will. The if Basically what's happening is, the fight or flight response kicks in, that
Yeah.
certain parts of the brain are shutting down, other parts of the brain are quite active, and you're on a state of hypervigilance, and there's a sense of danger, there's a sense of, well, this terrible thing that happened in the past potentially is happening to me again, or is going to be happening all over again. That's no state to be intimate, that's no state to
No.
emotionally, freely,
Mm,
warmly connect with anybody. So it's a biological process that's going on, and it's not
mm.
because the individual who was traumatized is being difficult, as some people will think, or it's not because they don't want
Thank you
to
for saying
engage.
that. Mm,
It's just because they can't help it. As much as they
yeah,
might love you, as much as they might really care about you, the brain at that moment in time does not have the ability to differentiate between past and present, between fact and fiction. So the brain is doing its own thing. It's taking you back to that place. And if you took a step back, logically, you might think, oh, why am I so silly? Which is what a lot of people say to themselves. I'm being
Yeah.
silly. I'm not, why am I doing this? It's not like this person is the same person. But actually, the brain does not have the ability in that moment in time to say, this thing happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, even, or 10 years ago. And this is a different person. We have to train the brain to
Mhm.
understand that difference. And
Yes.
if people are not aware of that, the automatic response all the time is going to be freeze, for example, or it's going to
Yeah.
be flight, for example.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. That is so important. That it's you're not silly. It's not you're not doing it. You're not selfish because I've heard that.
Mhm.
And it's going to require retraining of the brain
Yeah.
when those times when you're triggered by and many different things can trigger you. You know, as you said, you're not silly. I've been in marriage meetings,
Mhm.
in church settings where a question is asked, and I know that that's probably asked by a woman who has experienced sexual trauma. But the answer is stop being selfish, just please your husband. If you stop thinking negatively, you can do it. And sometimes we'll put my hand up and contribute because I know that sounds
Mhm.
like a woman who is struggling, and
Mhm.
she's not being selfish, she's not being silly, she's none of those things. She really is genuinely asking, what's happening to me? I don't understand, and how do I move on from this? So I'm really glad that you said it, and I hope somebody can get some freedom from hearing that for
Mhm.
themselves.
Mhm.
That's what's
I
happening.
think it's, just on the back of that, Joanna, I think it's really tricky because a lot of people who have experienced sexual trauma carry a level of shame and
Oh
guilt,
yeah. Hmm.
and are so kind of consumed with those feelings of shame and guilt that they don't actually think outside of that, and they don't necessarily have the right vocabulary or the right language to express what's happened to them. So if
Yeah.
somebody is asking a question that seems a bit off, I think that it's really important to be patient and try and dig a bit deeper and try to find out, oh, where's this question coming from? What's prompting this person to ask this question? And maybe privately investigate a bit more rather than providing a blanket response or being really dismissive, because that just kind of reinforces the trauma for that
Yeah.
person.
Absolutely. And you said shame and language, and I know where I grew up, we don't have the language to talk about. At least when I
Mhm.
was growing up, we didn't have the language. Nobody talks about it. And sometimes the shame comes from the feeling like it was your fault. That if it doesn't matter how the age that you were, it was your fault. What did you do?
Mhm.
Could you have, all of these questions, because most of the blame and the responsibility rest with the victim
Yeah.
oftentimes, and some of the shame is that layer of it. So being triggered, you
Mhm.
feel, and as you said, we're going back into that place, and it really affects how we connect, especially when we can't talk about it.
Mhm.
Or Alison, if we talk about it with somebody who's from a similar culture to us, who also blames victims, because sometimes that's a cultural thing where, well, what did you do? Well, why couldn't you? And so when, let's say in the case of a marriage, and the woman's the victim, and when she's triggered and she's struggling,
Mhm.
sometimes there's a lack of empathy and understanding
Mhm.
of, well, that was when you were 5, you're now 45. can we can
Mhm.
we can we explain like triggers? And I know you talked about it just now, but how could that conversation happen between that couple to get him to understand what's going on for her, and kind of release some of the pressure and stress that she may feel in those moments?
I think firstly is just really hearing her out, really listening to what she has to say, and how she's feeling about what's happened. And
Yeah.
it's really important to listen out for key emotions, key words like the shame, like confused, like embarrassed, like I felt dirty, for example. A lot of people say they felt dirty. And
Mm-hmm.
really validate those emotions, because for a lot of people, they've not been heard, they've not been validated, they've not had an opportunity to really express how they feel, and they've probably not given themselves the permission to voice those things. So if somebody finds themselves trying to explain or trying to be expressive about how they might have felt, or what they might be feeling, or what they went through, I think it's really, really important to just listen and validate how what those feelings are, because it would have taken a lot for them to even start that conversation. It would have
Yes.
taken a lot of thinking, a lot of deliberating, and if they start talking and the other person is dismissive or doesn't listen, they'll just recoil, and
Mm.
then it's
Yeah.
it's even harder to express themselves, and then that the kind of barriers will go up, the walls will go up, there'll be the lack of communication, lack of intimacy, also all of the problems that this thing is causing will even be magnified in
Yeah.
that relationship. So the
Yeah.
walls have to come down, and we can be compassionate. All we need to do is we need to just really listen attentively and validate and empathize. You might not think it's serious enough because it happened 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Well, the brain doesn't agree with that logic. The brain
Mm.
do what the brain will do. So the best way to move forward in that relationship, if you really do want to move forward, is to listen, is to
Yeah.
empathize, is to be compassionate, is to be validating, is to hold the other person. And it might take time. They might not
Yeah.
tell you everything all at once, and you have to kind of work with them at their pace and say to them, it's okay. Just tell me as much as you want to. And remember, I'm always going to be here for you if you need to
Mm.
talk some more. Because remember, with that sort of trauma, a lot of the time people remember in fragments. It doesn't all come
Yes.
back as at once. So it might be that you remember a small bit because something's triggered that, but you don't remember like the full event, how it happens from start to finish. So you need to be patient, and you need to expect that other bits of that narrative will come up at some point later
Yeah.
on.
That's so good, and these are the keys to having close connection in,
Mm,
in your relationship, when when you can develop that level of listening and empathy
yeah.
and understanding. And I believe if you're the spouse that is doing this, that you're going to need to lean on Jesus quite a lot to be able to give that. You might need your own support in terms of your own therapy to be able to understand it. But it really does help to deepen the relationship as opposed to the other way around. So if your goal is close, healthy, deep connection in your relationships, then this is the path. If
Hmm.
somebody in the relationship has experienced sexual trauma,
Yeah.
as you were talking, I thought about, so as you know, it can go different ways. So sometimes when that path is open early, sometimes we use sex as a coping mechanism. There is some level
Hmm.
of promiscuity.
Hmm.
Sometimes that happens because we're searching for love, and then there's some people who is completely shut down, and touch is
It's a no-no.
it's a no-no, right? I'm looking
Yeah.
for the word, right? Touch is a no-no. And so there we have we can have these two extremes that is going on. One
Yeah.
person is dealing with a compounded shame because, gosh, before I met Christ or before I was married, this is the life I lived. This is one of the reasons why, and now I'm carrying all of this. And
Hmm.
then there's the person where touch is an absolute no-no.
Hmm.
And I'm learning how to let you touch me. and it's
Yeah.
not easy for
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
Both have shame, a lot of shame, doesn't it?
Yes, and when we've gone through something that difficult, we develop defense mechanisms that work for us, right? So my defense
Absolutely.
mechanism could be, you know my personal space. You need to respect that, keep your distance. And for somebody else, that defense mechanism might be actually to kind of counter the impact of that trauma. They'll go out there and try to do a similar sort of thing, try to be as promiscuous as they
Yeah,
can. These are all ways of coping. We have to
absolutely.
understand that these are coping strategies. It's not, nobody's born wanting
Mm,
with an ambition to be promiscuous. Nobody's born with an ambition to be cold or rigid, or not affectionate, you know.
no.
And it's this whole topic is quite sad, is quite sensitive, because
Mm,
from just generally working with people, from my own experience talking to people, a lot a lot of women have
mm,
been traumatized sexually when they were young.
yes,
And not every woman's like talked about it. And sometimes the very people who will be against people who have been brave enough to come out and talk openly about it are other women. I just want
yeah.
to say to women out there that
Mm,
if you are hearing somebody saying, I went through this experience, please, please, please don't make it worse for them. Don't make it
mm,
worse for them. Because sometimes we think, well, the way to handle my own trauma is just to kind of blame somebody else, to project this
mm,
self-loathing onto
mm,
somebody else who's been brave enough to talk about it, and that's just not fair. So even if you haven't experienced the trauma, if somebody else is talking about it, because you haven't experienced it, you don't know how bad it is. So don't contribute
absolutely.
to pain.
Just listen, listen. I think
Absolutely.
it's the best thing to do, to listen. But I wanted to kind of raise that because I know that there's a woman struggling with those two right now, and she's never talked about it. She don't know how, because of the shame, because of the fear, and she don't understand what's happening. And as you said, well, it's 1 in 3, so we know quite a lot
Yeah.
of women sitting beside us in church, at work, on the bus, wherever, in our friendship groups,
Hmm.
have this experience, and there's so much shame around it that it will never be spoken. And we want to be able to bring the conversation here on Stories That Shape Us, because
Yeah.
that's a massive story that has shaped every area
Hmm.
of your life following that incident. And so, especially in this area where we're trying to, marriage is hard anyway. And this is just an added layer that we wanted to start the conversation on, so that if this is your experience, there's so much material that we can read,
Hmm.
that listen to. I post a podcast that I did around this subject in a group this morning, a prayer group that I saw. They were posting lots of stuff around um, sex and marriages,
Oh,
and I
I should
thought,
go
let me.
check it out.
I thought, let me add this perspective, because I bet oftentimes it doesn't come from a trauma perspective when they're talking about sex and marriages. It's kind of like, oh, the onus is on the woman. Be available, be available, be available, be available. And we're not considering some of the reasons why she might not be
Yeah.
able to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, and it's amazing work, obviously, that you're doing, that you're providing this space for people to either talk or hear about it. I think it's very important. The conversation has to start, right? And people are encouraged and motivated when other people are able to talk about it. And then people think, well, I didn't know. I thought I was the only one who's like had that
Mm.
sort of experience. So I just really want to commend, the work that you're doing. I think it's amazing. I think that, I just want to say to, women out there that we are stronger than we think sometimes, and we do have the resources that we need to get through things like this. But sometimes we need somebody to hold our hands and help walk the journey with us, and that's why, we have therapeutic spaces, we have, programs like this for people to either listen in or share their experiences, and there's healing in sharing as well. Obviously not the kind of sensitive details, but obviously, just general experiences of how you've healed, or how somebody else has helped you heal, or how, the word of God has helped you heal, or how your community has helped you heal. And also any tips for, what can how things can be made worse, so that we learn, to not kind of exercise or do some of the things that are just detrimental to people who are already suffering or struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, on that point of healing and resources that are available and spaces that you can go and talk, if this is your story, I really want to encourage you to do that. And I always say, Alison, not because we do the work, but because the freedom that you'll experience from doing the work is just, it's going to change your life. It
Yeah.
really is. And
Yeah.
so, when I do groups for women who are healing from sexual abuse, I think it's about week 3 or 4 that is, it's not your fault.
Hmm.
Always change. You feel the shift
Hmm.
when it's not your fault.
Hmm.
It's somebody else is telling you, and we go into that. So find someone to walk the journey with, a group of women who are doing the same work, who are healing from the same thing. Sometimes shame keeps people from therapy to process it, and from groups to process it. And I always said, if you're going to a group for women who are healing from sexual trauma, then everybody's there for the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ev-
Safety
Everybody.
in numbers, isn't it?
Right, right. Everybody's there for the same thing. So please, get support, because healing is possible. It really
Absolutely.
is. Is there
Absolutely.
any last thing that you'd like to say, Alison, before we wrap up?
I think I've said most of it before. I think, like you said, healing is possible. You are strong enough. You can overcome. But also, if you're listening in and you're somebody who is supporting somebody who has experienced sexual trauma, also you
Mm-hmm.
need somebody to talk to. So,
Yeah.
join a group, find a community, get the support that you need, and let's do this. We've got this, and let's do this together.
Yes, I agree with that. You need support too. There is a book that I often recommend to people, and now my brain is not helping me to remember the author of the book, but it's called Allies in Healing, and it's a beautiful book for partners who are supporting someone who's healing, because what it does is help you to understand what happens when they're triggered,
Hmm.
even as they start their healing journey. It helps you understand some of the ups and downs of that journey for them,
Hmm.
and what it might be for you.
Yeah.
It really helps you see. So it will kind of put words to your experience that you've lived maybe over many years. You go, oh, this is what it is. So it's called Allies in Healing, and it's not expensive. You can get it on Amazon. If you are the person that have experienced the sexual trauma, there is the companion book to that is called Courage to Heal, and there are many other resources. The Wounded Healer is a really good one. It's a book and a workbook, but I would advise you to walk the journey with someone. Sexual trauma is not a self-help healing journey
Hmm.
mostly.
Yeah.
Even when you read Beautiful Ashes and Joyce Meyer talk about the journey that God took her on, and she in that encouraged people, don't do, this might not work for you. It's best if you.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like not a self-help healing journey, it's healing from sexual trauma.
No, it's not. It's not at all. You do need you need somebody with the right expertise, somebody who is a professional, honestly. And if you have to invest in it, please invest in it. You will not only heal, but you'll learn other like skills and coping mechanisms that will be useful for the rest of your life. Things like managing depression, managing anxiety. So, invest in you, and because you're worth it and you deserve it.
Yeah, you are deserve it, and your relationship deserves it too.
Yeah,
And the intimacy and connection deepens in your relationship as you're healing and as your partner is understanding your journey, as you're able to share that. And it's just the vulnerability and the honesty that is introduced that perhaps wasn't there before that really helps to deepen the connection.
absolutely.
Um, yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you for coming, Alison. We could talk a lot about this subject. So throughout this week,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm having OBGYN come and talk about what happens when we're re-traumatized giving birth. That one's dear to my heart. So we're going to talk about sexual trauma and being re-traumatized and what is that like as a new mom, as perhaps you're a new wife, all of those things and the areas that it impacts. It's a safe space. There's no shame here. There's absolutely no judgment here. And we're going to dive into the stories that shape us that are difficult. Let's unpack them together. So I hope you'll join us. Thank you again, Alison. Where can
Thank
people
you.
find you, Alison? If because couples therapist sometimes is not easy to find
Mhm.
somebody who works with couples. Where can people find you?
If you're in the UK, obviously you can just go onto the counseling directory, and I'm on the counseling directory. If you Google my name, you'll probably find get my date. You can get my details online. So, otherwise, aliawuku@gmail.com. Drop me an email.
Fantastic. I hope you'll have an amazing day or week or evening or whatever it is. As you digest this information, just sit with it, sit with your journal, pray through it, and ask God to guide you to your next step that is going to help to deepen intimacy and connection in your relationship, but also will deepen understanding of self as you start or continue your healing journey. So thank you for joining me on this episode of Stories That Shape Us. I hope you'll join me on the next story.